That's such a sobering thought. Another interesting fact, they say 8 in 10 of IPPF service users are poor and vulnerable. Vulnerable is a very controversial word used at the United Nations to try to make people find acceptable what is unacceptable. They refer to the following groups as vulnerable groups: young people, people who use drugs, sex workers, people living with HIV, people in crisis settings, sexually and gender diverse groups, survivors of gender-based violence, and people with disabilities. Well, many of these groups are definitely vulnerable, and the United Nations humanitarian efforts and the humanitarian efforts of governments absolutely need to go to these groups. And young people, in many ways, are vulnerable and need help and support. But they have a huge focus on young people under the age of 25 and even younger than 18, sex workers, sexually and gender diverse groups, not just to help with their health needs, but to advance radical and harmful rights for what they call vulnerable groups. Now, here we see that 104.8 million sexual and reproductive health services were delivered to young people under the age of 25 by IPPF in 2019. Some of those included, I just thought this was an interesting statistic, that 7% of those services were voluntary surgical contraception, vasectomy, or tubal ligation. So Margaret Sanger would be really thrilled to see that this many years after IPPF's founding. Now, they also give a thank you to the following, you can see multiple very well-funded philanthropic organizations or foundations that have given to Planned Parenthood in 2019, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the European Commission, the Ford Foundation, Harvard, Levi Strauss, the Open Society Foundation, which we all know is connected to George Soros, RFSU, the United Nations Foundation, and so forth. It also lists the following governments and thanks them for funding IPPF in 2019, and the following UN agencies have funded IPPF in 2019. Again, notice it says the United States Agency for International Development, which again was legally restricted from funding organizations that promote or perform abortions under the Trump administration when these fundings were received. And back to document Advocacy Common Agenda to learn a little bit more. Here they state that their common agenda amongst all of their associations across the world defines 5 high-level changes that they're looking for: universal access to SRHR, comprehensive sexuality education, sexual and gender-based violence, and to integrate SRHR and gender equality into the political architecture of the governments and the countries across the world. And here they've kind of laid it out all in an infographic, but notice the center of their agenda: abortion and comprehensive sexuality education. And what is the pathway that they're going to take to reach all their goals? Social mobilization. That's why they spend a lot of money having people write articles. They have all sorts of journalists that are pushing their agendas with all their arguments in op-eds and newspaper articles, especially in developing countries. Pathway B, countering opposition. Now, I hope all of you on the call are part of this opposition and will be with us as we move forward. Direct advocacy, that's lobbying. They have lobbyists at all regional government form organizations, the United Nations, all the UN negotiations and national debates and legislatures everywhere. Learning and evidence, strategic partnerships, and institutional strengthening. And they identify their biggest challenge, or one of them at least. Comprehensive sexuality education, CSE, remains politically and socially controversial, and resistance from different fronts, including governments, parents, and religious leaders, prevents young people from accessing information informed by evidence about sexuality and SRHR services. Well, yeah, governments, parents, and religious leaders are appalled by what Planned Parenthood is trying to teach children about their blatant and aggressive abortion advocacy and much more. So here's a side note of what we just saw recently happen at the United Nations, possibly in large part because of Planned Parenthood's goal. Here they had in 2019 in their report, their goal that SRHR would be included as an essential component of UHC, that's universal health care, in the declaration of the high-level meeting on UHC in the United Nations General Assembly in 2019. Well, did they make their goal? Because that's already happened. They did. This is the political declaration of the high-level meeting on universal health coverage, UHC. And here's the paragraph that they pushed along with their partners and allies in the governments and UN agencies. Ensure by 2030 universal access to sexual and reproductive health care and services. We've already seen what that encompasses. Ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. And this, I don't have time to go in more detail, but I'll just say the governments who are trying to prevent this term from being used to promote abortion always add in UN negotiations this phrase, as agreed in accordance with the Program of Action of the International Conference on Population Development and the Beijing Platform for Action. Now, they add that in because especially the Program of Action of the International Conference on Population Development has lots of caveats. It says that abortion can only be determined by governments at the national level, that abortion cannot be used as a method of family planning, that this document doesn't create any new rights, and so forth. So when governments who are trying to limit this term to not include abortion put that into documents, those who want it to be interpreted to bring in all these radical sexual and gender rights and abortion rights add, and the outcome documents of their review conferences, because IPPF, Planned Parenthood, a number of UN agencies, but especially UNFPA and UN Women have held all sorts of conferences which had outcome documents that brought in all of their agendas that went way beyond the Program of Action or the Beijing Platform for Action.